The Goblin Slayer and the Little Red Riding Hood. When watching The Goblin Slayer, something becomes familiarly apparent. All of the characters in The Goblin Slayer do not carry proper names. Ranging from the series protagonist, the Goblin Slayer, to the more background characters, such as Cowgirl's uncle, the cast is named after their role in the story. It reminded me of the fairy tales I had read in my youth. For instance, take the tale of the Little Red Riding Hood. None of the characters in this fairy tale have proper names. They are either defined by their appearance, such as Little Red, or by their greater role in the story, such as the hunter and the mother. In fairy tales, this namelessness is often utilized when the function the character serves outweighs their personal identity. It is not so much important that the wolf have a name, so as long as he serve as a lesson to medieval European children that they should obey their parents' warnings when walking through dangerous areas and to be aware of friendly strangers who may hide monsters inside of them. Or, from the psychoanalyst perspective, it does not matter that Little Red have a proper name as long as she serve as a symbol to teach young girls about the dangers of their sexual impulses. Because even if men look friendly or look attractive, they can end up devouring you. This made me think about what greater function or lesson the characters of the Goblin Slayer could be trying to convey. After all, it is a bit risky to have nameless characters because you just end up having to rely on archetypes, and they can be really hard to escape. It can become difficult to connect to a character over many episodes or give a character depth beyond the archetypical box they are placed in. For example, the protagonist is already being memed to death about how his motivation is so one-dimensional. We get it. He wants to slay goblins above all else. Anyways, after making this weird connection between the Goblin Slayer and the Little Red Riding Hood, the most superficially obvious lesson that I pulled out of the series is what is referred to as the Crisis of Undifferentiation. The term simply means you have difficulty in differentiating between two things that are shapeless enough to cause confusion but still have a form. These things are usually abstract ideas. In the Goblin Slayer, it seems like the namelessness of the characters help create blurred lines between the protagonists and the antagonists. Just like the humans, the goblins, the antagonists, are also defined by their function. They don't have individual names but are referred to as shamans, goblin champions, etc. The show plays well with muddying the lines between what a goblin is and what a goblin is not. The goblins are set out to be the monsters, but are they the only monsters? What about the Goblin Slayer and his allies? Little Red Riding Hood has its crisis of undifferentiation when it plays with the idea of what a wolf, which represents a monster, is and what a wolf is not, and we're going to get into that a bit later. By having nameless characters, the Goblin Slayer is creating a crisis of undifferentiation by blurring the lines and making it difficult to differentiate who symbolizes the wolf, and ultimately tries to teach us that it is not always obvious who the monster is, because the protagonist of the series himself has many monstrous traits. Before we talk about who the wolf is, let's quickly look at the story of the Little Red Riding Hood. Simplified, the story is as follows. In this tale, a young girl, on her way to visit her sick mother, meets a wolf. He learns of her plans and distracts her by pointing out the flowers along the path. Leaving the girl to pick the flowers, the wolf goes to the grandmother's house, devours her, and awaits the arrival of the girl. From here, depending on the version, she either just tragically dies or a hunter nearby comes and cuts both her and her grandmother out of the wolf's stomach, killing the wolf. The wolf is important in the story because he is the one who creates the crisis of undifferentiation. The wolf is doing what all great fairy tale characters do. They give a sense of shapelessness, but at the same time have a recognizable form. The shapelessness of the wolf comes from the fact that he acts like a human, but at the same time, he is recognizably a wolf. Think about the term werewolves. They are basically hybrids created to illustrate this crisis. When Little Red first meets the wolf, he masquerades as a friendly gentleman, but the next time she encounters him, he drops the veil and we see his true form, the monster. Now, of course, the wolf is a monster from the human's perspective, but you can always look through different lenses and justify the wolf's behavior. After all, he is made out of flesh and blood and he must eat to survive. We don't know his story. He may have been desperately hungry when Little Red shows up. Furthermore, let's not forget, Little Red enters the forest, which is his home. Humans have been pushing back forests, and less forests ultimately mean less food for the wolf. From this new context, who is the monster? Is it Little Red, who represents the humans, or the wolf, who does not represent the monster, but the animals? Returning to the Goblin Slayer, the story Simplified is as follows. Goblins ravage a boy's hometown, tormenting and then finally killing his sister right in front of him. The boy, reeling from the mental scars, decides to dedicate his life in the pursuit of slaying goblins. From the protagonist's perspective, the goblins symbolize the wolf, or the monsters in the series. But due to how the series plays with what constitutes being a goblin, the Goblin Slayer himself can be a goblin, and thus he could be the wolf who symbolizes the monsters. In fact, the Goblin Slayer directly says this in the series. His definition differs from his sister's, who says jealousy is what creates a goblin. The series blurs the line here, and by making goblins not a physical entity but an abstract idea. Just like you don't need to take the physical form of a wolf, who symbolizes the monster, to embody a wolf, the Goblin Slayer also shares many other features that symbolizes the wolf that are not as directly highlighted in the series. For example, just like the wolf goes from his home, the forest, to the home of his victims, so does the Goblin Slayer go from his home to the goblin's home, which are in dungeons. Just like the wolf, who does not torment the victims and eats them cleanly by just swallowing them, so does the Goblin Slayer kill his victims mercifully. Just like the wolf outwardly behaves like a gentleman, with his predatory behavior only revealing itself through the jewel on his mouth or when he grins and we can see his sharp teeth, the Goblin Slayer also behaves gentleman-like, and we only get to see his predatory behavior when the red light flares from his eyes. We could go on and on about wolfish symbolisms and how it relates to the Goblin Slayer, but the point to remember is that the series is doing this on purpose. It is creating blurred lines between good and evil, wolf or not wolf. The scene that best illustrates this is when the Goblin Slayer goes to slaughter what amounts to be infants. The screeches echo in your ear as he squashes the helpless and the defenseless. What the Goblin Slayer does here is the exact thing the goblins did to his hometown. He goes to their dungeons, kills them, and takes their valuables. Two wrongs don't make a right, and it's no kidding when he says that in turn he becomes a goblin to them. Just like how we talked about the wolf being justified in eating Little Red because he ultimately needs food, we might be able to justify the goblins. After all, we don't really know the goblins' motives because we are never told of their motives, and we are only shown them when they are engaged in violence. Maybe the Goblin Slayer was wrong and there is such a thing as a good goblin. Maybe humans have been killing them and stealing from the goblins and they are just getting revenge. We don't know. It could be that the goblins are just pure evil with no redeeming features. But the show tries to make it a little iffy. Who symbolizes the monster is not so black and white and is up for debate. The last parallel I want to draw is that of the fate of the wolf and the Goblin Slayer. In almost all versions of the fairy tale, The fate of Little Red differs, but the fate of the wolf is always the same, which is death. After all, the wolf is the symbol of a monster or evil, and people in the old age believed that for God's natural order to be restored, the wolf, the monster, the devil who lures young girls, has to die. The namelessness of the characters in this anime try to muddy the water between who the wolf is and who is not the wolf. The goblins or the Goblin Slayer are not necessarily evil just because they commit violence. We know some violence is needed. After all, it was the violence used by the hunter that ends up saving the two women. From the perspective of the hunter, he used violence nobly. Is the Goblin Slayer using violence nobly, or is he the wolf who must die in the end for the natural order to be restored? What do you guys think? I would love to hear your opinion.